All right, so we're going to go to our read aloud. We've read chapters 12, 13, and 14 on Friday. So I'm going to switch to the camera and we're going to read 15, 16, and maybe 17. We'll see. All right. Okay. So we were. Okay. So on chapter 14, this one is called Sammy. I can do. Okay. It was a horrible, stinky, rainy day. Some rainy days are fun and exciting, but not this one. This one stunk. All the children were wet and wore smelly raincoats. The whole room smelled awful. Ew, it stinks in here, said Mauricia. Everybody laughed, but she was right. There was one good thing, however. There was a new boy in class. New kids are always fun, except no one could even tell what the new boy looked like. He was completely covered by his raincoat. Class, said Mrs. Jules, I'd like you all to meet Sammy. Let us show him what a nice class we can be. Leslie walked up and smiled at Sammy. But her smile quickly turned into a frown. You smell terrible, she said. Leslie, exclaimed Mrs. Jules, that's no way to greet a new member of our class. Mrs. Jules wrote Leslie's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. But he does, Mrs. Jules, said Leslie. He smells awful. You're ugly, Sammy replied. Now, Sammy, that's no way to talk, said Mrs. Jules. Leslie's a very pretty girl. She's ugly, said Sammy. Allison spoke up. Well, you smell terrible and are probably even uglier, but nobody can see you because you are hiding under that smelly old raincoat. That will be enough of that, said Mrs. Jules. Now, Sammy, why don't you take off your coat and hang it in the closet? Let us all see how nice you look. I don't want to, you old windbag, said Sammy. That's because he's so ugly, said Leslie. I'm sure he's quite handsome, said Mrs. Jules. He's just shy. Here, let me help you. Mrs. Jules took off Sammy's coat for him, but underneath it was still another raincoat, even dirtier and smellier than the first one. They still couldn't see his face. Ooh, now he smells even worse, said Mauricia. You don't exactly smell like a rose either, Sammy replied. Mrs. Jules took off his second raincoat, but there was still another one under that, and the smell became so bad that Mrs. Jules had to run and stick her head out the window to get some fresh air. You're all a bunch of pigs, Sammy screeched. Dirty, rotten pigs. The smell was overwhelming. Sammy just stood there, hidden under his raincoat. Mrs. Jules wrote Sammy's name under the word discipline. Send him home on the kindergarten bus, said Joy. Not with me, said Todd. Mrs. Jules held her nose, walked up to Sammy, and removed his raincoat. She threw it out the window, but he had on still another one. Sammy hissed, Oh, hey, old windbag. Watch where you throw my good clothes. Mrs. Jules put a check next to Sammy's name on the blackboard. Then she took off another raincoat and threw it out the window. The smell got worse, for he had still another one. Sammy began to laugh. His horrible laugh was even worse than his horrible voice. When Sammy first came into the room, he was 4 feet tall. But after Mrs. Jules removed 6 of his raincoats, he was only 3 feet tall, and there were still more raincoats to go. Mrs. Jules circled his name and removed another coat. She threw it out the window. Then she put a triangle around the circle and threw another one of his coats outside. She kept doing this until Sammy was only 1.5 feet high. With every coat she took off, Sammy's laugh got louder and the smell got worse. Some of the children held their ears. Others could hold only one ear because they were holding their nose with the other. It was hard to say which was worse, the laugh or the smell. Sammy stopped laughing and said, Hey, old windbag, if you take off one more of my coats and throw it out the window, I'll bite your head off. They smell too bad for me to allow them in my classroom, said Mrs. Jules. You can pick them up when you leave. They smell better than you do, pighead, Sammy shouted. Mrs. Jules didn't stop. She took off another one of his raincoats, then another, and then another. Sammy was only 4 inches tall, 3 inches tall, 2 inches tall. At least she removed the final coat. All that was there was a dead rat. Well, I don't allow dead rats in my classroom, said Mrs. Jules. She picked it up by the tail and put it in a plastic bag and threw it away. Mrs. Jules didn't allow dead rats in her class. Todd once brought in a dead rat for show and tell, and Mrs. Jules made him throw that one away, too. I'm glad Sammy isn't alone in our classroom, said Rondi. I didn't like him very much. Yes, said Mrs. Jules. We caught another one. Dead rats were always trying to sneak into Mrs. Jules' class. That was the third one she'd caught since September. Oh my goodness. I know we probably read that on Friday. I just wanted to remind us. I think that one's kind of a funny one. This one is called Dee Dee. This story contains a problem and a solution. Dee Dee was a mousy-looking kid. Unlike most children at Wayside School, she liked recess better than spelling. As soon as the recess bell rang, she would jump up from her seat and run out the door. There were big signs in Wayside School on every floor. No jumping down the stairs. Dee Dee never seemed to notice the signs. She jumped down the stairs. Some children took the stairs 2 at a time. Dee Dee took them 10 at a time. That was on the way down. It was funny. She never seemed to be quite in the same hurry on the way back up. There was another sign at Wayside School. No cutting across the grass. Dee Dee must not have ever seen that one either. She cut across the grass and ran up to Louie, the yard teacher. I want a green ball, Dee Dee said. The green balls were the best. I'm all out of green balls, said Louie. Okay, then I want a red ball, said Dee Dee. The red balls were just as good as the green balls. They didn't bounce as high, but actually sometimes you don't want a ball to bounce too high. I'm all out of red balls too, said Louie. Do you have anything left? Asked Dee Dee. Dee Dee meant anything besides the yellow ball. There was one yellow ball at Wayside School, and Louie was always trying to get rid of it. It didn't bounce, and it never went the way it was kicked. Anything at all? Asked Dee Dee. Today is your lucky day, said Louie. I have one ball left just for you, the one and only yellow ball. No, thanks, said Dee Dee. Aw, come on, take it, said Louie. Why don't you ever have any green or red balls? Asked Dee Dee. I do, said Louie, but the other children ask first. By the time you get here, they're all gone. But that's because I have to come all the way from the 30th story. How do you expect me to compete with kids from the first or second? She asked. That's why I saved you the yellow ball, said Louie. Everybody wanted it, but I saved it just for you. I bet, said Dee Dee. She took the yellow ball and bounced it on the ground. It stopped dead with a thud. She stepped back, ran up, and kicked it. It went backwards over her head. She didn't bother chasing it. Instead, she played hopscotch with Jenny and Leslie. She thought it was disgusting. The next day, Dee Dee asked Mrs. Jules if she could go to recess early. Why? Asked Mrs. Jules. So I can get a green ball before Louie gives them all out, said Dee Dee. I'm glad you have a good reason, said Mrs. Jules. Yes, you may go. But first, spell Mississippi for me. Spelling was not Dee Dee's best subject. By the time she finally got it right, it was 5 minutes late for recess. She jumped down the stairs, cut across the grass, and ran up to Louie. There were no green balls left. There were no red balls left either. However, there was still the yellow ball. Dee Dee played jump rope with Joy and Mauricia. It was no better than hopscotch, so Dee Dee's problem was to figure out a way to get a green ball, or at least a red ball. You already know that this story also contains a solution. Dee Dee figured it out. See if you can too. Remember everything you know about Dee Dee, Wayside School, and Mrs. Jules? Hint, the next day Dee Dee brought a cream cheese and jelly sandwich, some nuts, and shredded cheese in her lunchbox. Here's what happened. Just before recess, Dee Dee smeared the cream cheese and jelly all over her face. Then she stuffed her mouth with nuts and hung the shredded cheese from her nose. Then she closed her eyes. She looked just like a dead rat. Todd was in on the plan. "Mrs. Jules," he called, "there's a dead rat in the classroom." Mrs. Jules was very put out. "I want that dead rat out immediately." When Mrs. Jules said immediately, she meant it. Dee Dee instantly found herself outside on the playground. "I want a green ball," she said. Louis pretended that he didn't hear her. "May I please have a green ball?" asked Dee Dee. Louis gave her a green ball. "I don't know how you did it, Dee Dee, but you're first today," he said. When Mrs. Jules found out that Dee Dee and Todd had tricked her, she sent Todd home early on the kindergarten bus. Dee 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 threw the green ball on the ground. It bounced 50 feet straight up in the air, and then she caught it. "You don't like me, do you?" she asked Louis. "Sure I do," said Louis. "No, you don't," said Dee Dee. "Yes, I like you," said Louis. "No, you don't," Dee Dee insisted. "Yes, I like you, I really do," said Louis. "Are you sure?" asked Dee Dee. "Yes," said Louis. "Don't you believe me?" "I guess so," said Dee Dee. "Do you like me?" asked Louis. "You bet," said Dee Dee. "You're my best friend." "Terrific," said Louis. "I always wanted to be best friends with a dead rat." All right, we're going to stop there for today. Hope you guys are enjoying this story. If you want to share what part of the story so far is your favorite, that would be great too. All righty. Don't forget to keep reading at home too. Have a great day.